and sexual deviancy. But he chose to approach Gothic writing through the use of a detached narrator, the skeptical Geoffrey Crayon. Irving's Crayon was a construct of his neoclassical influences and continuously encounters bizarre situations, such as that of Gottfried Wolfgang, the protagonist of Adventure of a German Student. Writing from the point of view of his skeptical and rational Crayon, Irving is free to use Gothic sensibilities in constructing a ghost story about a student who thinks he's found the woman of his dreams, only to discover he's in love with a corpse. Irving's use of ambiguity in connection to romantic supernaturalism is this story's key aspect. Supernatural ambiguity describes how a story can be read as having a realistic explanation or one that is overtly supernatural. Through Crayon, Irving can present his ghastly tale as either the distorted perception of a sick mind, which is an acceptable outcome for any rational reader, or as a chilling account of a demon-possessed corpse that would thrill a reader searching for a supernatural tale. Irving, through Crayon, recounts the tale of Gottfried, a lonely German university student. He spends his days alone amid occult books and strange writings in old, decrepit libraries. Irving describes Gottfried as a literary ghoul, feeding in the charnel house of decayed literature. This points to an unhealthy mind too fixated on the esoteric. Gottfried also insists he was being haunted by an evil spirit, or as Irving writes, he took up the notion that there was an evil influence hanging over him, an evil genius or spirit seeking to ensnare him and ensure his perdition. Gottfried is sent to Paris for his studies in hopes that the city would add cheer to his life. Unfortunately for Gottfried, he arrived at Paris at the height of the Reign of Terror, the period of bloody executions at the height of the French Revolution. All the blood and the death only deepens Gottfried's depression and loneliness, and he continues to lock himself away in rotting libraries of the occult. Painfully shy, especially around women, Gottfried's dreams are haunted by a vision of a perfectly beautiful lover. Irving writes, his fancy would deck out images of loveliness far surpassing the reality, a female face of transcendent beauty. He became passionately enamored of this shadow of a dream. One late night, as he heads back to his apartment, Gottfried passes the square where the public executions have been taking place. There at the steps of a scaffold, Gottfried sees a beautiful woman alone and dressed all in black. He beheld a shadowy form, Irving writes, the very face which haunted his dreams. Recognizing her as the woman from his dreams, Gottfried takes her back to his home, and there the two spend the night together. In the morning, Gottfried discovers his newfound lover's corpse and immediately alerts the authorities. Irving writes, the officer stepped forward, undid the black counter around the neck of the corpse, and the head rolled onto the floor. The officers revealed to Gottfried's horror that the corpse was that of an aristocratic woman that had been beheaded the day before. Gottfried is driven mad by this revelation and winds up in a madhouse. Now, in an interpretation based on reality, the terror of the tale comes from the psychological horror of a mind slipping towards insanity and too far into the world of idealized fancy. Irving establishes the possibility that the entire episode was one born in Gottfried's diseased mind. Considering his preoccupation with the occult and his utter lack of meaningful social contact, the reader has plenty of reason to believe that Gottfried may well have been a corpse-robbing necrophiliac. One instance that points to this possibility happens once Gottfried is back at his apartment with the woman. Irving writes, the perplexity now commenced with the student how to dispose of the helpless being thus thrown upon his protection. Irving's use of the word dispose in this phrase is peculiar and points to the possibility that Gottfried had, in fact, willingly absconded with the corpse of a recently executed noblewoman, and he's unconsciously wondering how to be rid of the corpse once he's done with it. Gottfried's actions finally come to a head when he is forced to see in full view of the Parisian authorities his dream lover for the headless corpse that she is. When Gottfried shrieks, the fiend has gained possession of me. I'm lost forever. He is merely attempting to mask his perverted behavior in the form of demonic mischiefs rather than take responsibility for his actions. Therefore, the reader is seeing the perverse fantasy in Gottfried's mind with only hints of what is happening in the real world. However, a more overtly supernatural interpretation of the story is the notion that Gottfried's predicament is of pure deviltry, rather than one of his own mind. Gottfried may be another incarnation of the Faustian protagonist that so fascinated Irving. Just as the archetypal Faust traded his soul to the devil for godlike knowledge, Gottfried may have unwittingly struck a bargain with a demon for the perfect woman. Alone, all day in decrepit libraries, with infernal words and strange writings lingering in his mind, it would have been easy for Gottfried to have his deepest desires inadvertently made known to an evil spirit that he himself had unwittingly evoked. When Gottfried sees his dream woman that fateful night, he's getting exactly what he bargained for. However, rather than sign a contract with his blood, as do other Faustian protagonists, including Tom Walker, Gottfried finalizes his pact by having sex with his dream woman. Afterwards, upon realizing that his dream woman was a day-old headless corpse, Gottfried shrieks, the fiend has gained possession of me. I am lost forever. Gottfried's cry is that of a man whose mind breaks from grasping the sickening conclusion of the bargain he struck with whatever fiend had possessed the corpse of his dream woman. Just as Faust was condemned to hell once his contract was up, Gottfried ends up in a madhouse and ultimately dies for his cadaverous dalliance. In the years following Irving, America has continued to have a fascination with supernatural and with horror. Countless writers have surpassed Irving in terms of success and in the graphicness of their content, but it's difficult to imagine these genres having any existence at all without the Wandering Gentleman from New York. Certainly writers such as Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne were influenced by Irving's use of supernatural ambiguity, as well as the short story form that Irving pioneered, and numerous writers in turn owe debts to both Poe and Hawthorne. Irving gave America its very own Faustian story, and brought into the reader's mind the distinct horror that comes with not knowing if a supernatural event was born inside a person's mind, or if a corpse could truly be reanimated by a demonic spirit. Many of Irving's short stories were steeped in the mysterious and the supernatural, and these were embraced because, as one critic put it, the marvelous takes a stronger hold on the mind than any rationalist can offer. Simply put, Washington Irving was America's first scaremaster. Thank you.
All right, now, does the audience have any questions?
I do.
Okay.
I was wondering about Irving's faith. Did he believe in devils or?
Irving's father was fiercely Episcopalian, and the biographical information that I've read regarding Irving seems to indicate that he was a bit resentful of all of the forced prayer and worship and whatnot. He never showed any particular inclination towards religion, but he did have a spiritual side, one that sort of encouraged, that it's what pushed him towards seeking the supernatural, I think. And in some of his writings, he's actually makes indirect references to Scripture, though nothing overt. Definitely not, I think, to the extent that other writers did at the time.
Are you familiar with the 20th century short story, The Devil and Daniel Webster by
Oh, yeah. Yes, I was familiar with that tale before I was familiar with The Devil and Tom Walker. And then I discovered that, I can't remember the name of the author, but the guy who wrote Devil and Daniel Webster was actually essentially just copying Tom Walker and adding some elements on top of it. My original idea for a paper was a compare and contrast between both stories. And then the argument I wanted to make was that Irving's tale was superior because The Devil and Daniel Webster doesn't actually do anything of any depth. It's cutesy in a way, but it doesn't do what Irving did, which is he combined diametrically opposed influences and sort of kickstarted the short story form in America. And whereas the other story didn't really have that kind of impact, even though it's the one most people are familiar with indirectly. So.
All right, George. So, you were talking about how in Tom Walker, or it was, and how Tom Walker was influenced by Faust. So, you talked about at the ending that Tom Walker seeks religion to basically kind of save his soul. Is that if I'm so? Do you mind kind of like thinking out loud, like what is the difference between Faust's approach as the deadline was near with the devil and Tom Walker's approach when his deadline was?
I'm more familiar with Marlowe's Dr. Faustus than I am Goethe's Faust in terms of like how well I know the material. Right. But both of those originals are actually very similar. And I would argue that Tom Walker's path is very similar to traditional Faust. Faust started to try to, well, at first he resisted forgiveness, whereas Tom was desperately grasping towards it. But a period of time, and I didn't discuss this, but a period of time does happen, years as a moneylender, that he had the opportunity, but he never pursued forgiveness. And it isn't until the end that he started getting really, fire and brimstone, and look how hard and how loud I pray. And of course, by that point, it was too late. And the same thing actually happens to Faustus, so.
What about, and I think this is sort of the gist of your paper, but a lot of studies, scholars avoid Irving. They kind of see him as
Yeah.
a hack. But
Yeah.
I noticed with your last slide that you seem to indicate that you think maybe he's more important. Could you kind of capsulize it for the audience?
That's one of the reasons I actually chose Irving rather than one of the easier authors to pursue like a Hawthorne, where there was such a depth of scholarly work. But Irving is treated as sort of like a guy that had no real depth, that he was kind of soft. But I kind of thought that was missing the point. And even though I'm not, as well versed as some of these scholars that have written these papers that I was studying, the point I wanted to make to the audience was Irving was important. He may not have been as good a writer as Hawthorne or as Poe, but they took ideas from him and they made something better out of it. So there was something to be said for being the guy that set the table that everybody else got to eat at. If that's one way of actually putting it. I know it's kind of goofy, but hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, and I have one more question, and we have about, I guess, a minute left. So, would you reiterate for us what your title is? Because I noticed in the program they don't have your actual title, and I wonder if there was any connection to
I
that
just-
slide that you
Yeah.
chose. Like, you can just articulate it. You don't have to show the slide.
The road to the supernatural. So if you kind of look at Irving from a historical perspective, as a youth he encountered folklore and he was also reading neoclassical work. And then, he was traveling, he went to Europe, he went all over Europe, and it's like he was on a road that eventually led him to writing stories that most people are familiar with Sleepy Hollow or Rip Van Winkle. But I kind of thought that Devil and Tom Walker and Adventure of a German Student were better combinations of all those. He had reached that road, the end of that road, as far as he was going to go with his ability. And I don't know if anybody noticed, but the opening slide had a long road, and at the end was this sort of a dark corridor, you could barely see it. And that was sort of the point I wanted to make, that you can't really get the point across in a presentation because you only have 15 minutes. But in the paper, I sort of go through his evolution to get to where he was at, and then I apply all of that to sort of like a breakdown of his influence, of his stories. So.
Okay, great, thank you.